Hey everyone! Today's story is about the strongest mage in the Empire who collapses after being overworked on the battlefield for years. But when she wakes up, she finds herself under the protection of the strongest knight from the enemy kingdom. So with that said, let's begin the story. That stupid, perverted prince, the girl hates him. She said she's had enough and is going to bed. She doesn't want to hurt anyone, and she doesn't want to fight. The prince stood before her. She thought that this beautiful sword would help her easily end her life. So be it. Fiona was ordered to obey the prince's command. She flatly refused. She was asked to kill. She replied that she didn't want to kill anyone. She was told that the price of disobedience was death. The girl replied that she would rather die than to obey him. And then she opened her eyes. It was a dream. A girl with long blonde hair and dark eyes, named Fiona, woke up in a luxurious bed in a large room. At first, she didn't understand where she had woken up. Then everything fell into place. She was surrounded by fine furniture and luxurious diamond chandeliers. Everything seemed to glow with opulence. Bright sunlight flooded the room. Fiona immediately thought about how magnificent the room was. She wondered how long she had slept because she felt incredibly light. The girl looked around, still not fully comprehending this morning. She looked at her hands, and her expression grew sadder. Those cursed seals were on her hands again, round and large. She didn't like it. Sadness appeared in her eyes. And of course, the girl noticed that the sacred relic was nowhere to be found. She tried to create a flame from her hand, but there was no flame. Fiona assumed that the seals on her hands were blocking her magic. Before she lost consciousness, they had finally completed their mission to clear out the monsters. She lay down to sleep, and immediately a message appeared from that prince. He ordered her to steal the magic stones of the kingdom of Elsida, and, half asleep, she went to carry out his order. On the way, they encountered the most powerful bearer of the sacred relic, and she was taken captive. But she doubted that prisoners would be kept in a damp room. Yet this prince would have done exactly that. At that moment, she hoped he would kill her, but that never happened. She became terribly curious as to why she had been placed in such luxurious quarters. Fiona surmised that perhaps there were simply no other cells available. She kept looking around and examining this opulent room. It became clear to her that the sacred relic had been right after all. She was in Elsida, and suddenly a guy walked in, tall, handsome, dressed in expensive clothes. He apologized for his sudden appearance. The guy thought Fiona was still asleep, so he'd entered without knocking. He was wearing a neat white shirt and black business pants. Fiona said nothing, but found the young man's voice very pleasant. She hadn't expected an apology, but soon politely replied that everything was fine and that he shouldn't apologize, because there was no need to worry so much about an enemy's feelings. The guy's face paled, and he grew a little indignant. In a serious voice, he said that they had had to put these chains on the girl, and for the sake of propriety, he apologized for it once more. The girl looked at him with sad, puzzled eyes. The guy didn't get it and asked if he'd said something strange. The girl replied that he had, because she hadn't expected them to be so polite to her. And without that scary look on his face, this guy, in Fiona's opinion, looked like a completely different person. The guy replied that the same could be said about her. Both were unhappy. The guy cleared his throat and suddenly said that he still hadn't heard the girl's name. He introduced himself as Matthias. The girl introduced herself in return. Matthias replied that it was a nice name and smiled slightly, a barely noticeable and serious smile. Fiona noticed that he had a pleasant smile. And after that, another guy suddenly walked into the room. His name was Luke. He was a master of cursed seals. Luke was dressed in a long robe, high boots, and a work suit. His hair and hairstyle were a bit messy. Luke turned to Fiona and said he hadn't noticed she had woken up. He apologized for not even knocking before entering. A naive, slightly childlike smile played on his face. He called Fiona a golden mage and asked how she was feeling. The girl replied that she had slept well here. Luke was surprised and said she was strange. He asked, "Where's your don't you dare talk to me line?" Luke had expected Fiona to treat them like worms or ignore them entirely. But the guy realized he hadn't introduced himself. He quickly said his name was Luke. Fiona replied by saying her name. Suddenly, an interesting thought occurred to Luke. He moved closer to Matthias and whispered some important information in his ear. He asked Mr. Matthias, what happened? The guy hadn't imagined Fiona to be like this, because her whole tough, battle-hardened image had vanished like the wind. And Luke had butterflies in his stomach. He asked Matthias what he should do about it now. Matthias replied that he understood him, but he advised Luke to put those feelings aside. Fiona was still sitting on the luxurious, spacious bed. The guys were telling each other that one of them was creepy, that one of them was annoying. The girl sat there watching their behavior. She thought they got along very well with each other, and she was even a little jealous. Fiona's hair was tousled, falling carelessly off her shoulders. Meanwhile, Matthias and Luke were getting closer and closer to each other. Then Matthias turned to Fiona. He noticed she was hungry. He figured she'd slept all day and her body was still recovering. He wasn't sure if Fiona's body could handle regular food. The girl was surprised that they would even feed her here, in addition to providing a luxurious room and a plush bed. She was a little indignant and said that, actually, she would eat anything. And she thanked Matthias. She was very happy. And Matthias hurried out of the room, saying he'd bring her something to eat. And so, Luke and Fiona were left alone. Luke was surprised by Matthias's behavior. He began to wonder if this was really the same Mr. Matthias. The guy covered his mouth with his hand in surprise, because he hadn't expected to see that. And so the guy turned to the girl. He told her that they were all very surprised when she lost consciousness right in the middle of the fight. He asked if Matthias was to blame for this. Fiona replied that that wasn't entirely true. She explained that she really wanted to sleep at that moment. She was already about to wrap up the group and head home to catch up on sleep, but then they ran into Matthias. Luke asked in surprise, "How did that even happen?" Fiona sadly explained that she had been working a lot lately, without any breaks to sleep. Their prince used her however he pleased, and she had to fight day and night. Fiona hung her head sadly. She understood that these people must have seen her as an enemy, but for some reason, they had shown her so much concern. Even though she hadn't killed anyone, she had harmed many people from their country on the prince's orders. And Fiona could not escape execution. Her hands were chained so tightly that she couldn't stand up. She wondered how they would kill her. Would it hurt? She admitted she didn't want to feel any pain. The girl was asked to follow his orders to kill them all. She resisted, saying that death did not scare her, but she could not let this prince get the better of her. That thick-headed prince. Heartless. Fiona hates him. Meanwhile, Matthias returned with a large tray of food. Suddenly, at that moment, the girl lifted her t-shirt and looked at her stomach. A certain power immediately awoke in Luke, and Matthias suddenly turned away and was outraged. Fiona saw that the pain-inducing seal had disappeared. The seal controlling her body and mind was gone. The girl turned to the guys and asked if she had had a seal that looked like a rose. Luke smiled slyly, covered his face, and said with a laugh that he, a master of cursed seals, had dealt with the seal. And he immediately warned that, of course, he hadn't looked any further than necessary. The girl sadly lowered her head. The seal was supposed to disappear only after her death. But what a blessing that was for her. She thanked Luke, who had thereby freed her from that worthless prince. Matthias and Luke stood there, staring at her, not knowing what to do. Fiona couldn't believe they had shown her so much kindness. She hoped they would grant her an easy death. The girl said that the seal reacted even to thoughts of resistance, and that really annoyed her. She clapped her hands and smiled. Finally, she could do whatever she wanted. Luke realized that the prince was a real jerk for creating a seal for Fiona that reacted to her thoughts. Matthias turned to Luke and said sternly that Fiona needed to eat first. He placed a tray with food prepared for her in front of her. On the tray were white bread, hot soup, vegetables, fresh meat, and fruit on plates. Fiona hadn't eaten anything like this in a long time and was very happy. Matthias wished her bon appetit. He asked what she meant when she said she hadn't eaten anything like this in a long time. In his opinion, shouldn't the greatest mage in the empire, like her, have special privileges? Listening to her, one got the impression that the girl hadn't been fed at all. Matthias's face looked displeased. Fiona nearly choked in surprise. Privileges? She had no privileges whatsoever. She had been housed in the most remote part of the palace. She had a roof over her head, they gave her simple clothes, and they even fed her. But she admitted that over the past 6 months, the food had only gotten worse. She ate stale bread, cold water from a glass, and some kind of incomprehensible porridge. Luke was horrified by these stories and couldn't understand how they could treat Fiona that way. Now she was happily eating delicious soft rolls and soup. Fiona continued her story and explained that it was all because she had refused to sleep with that perverted prince. Immediately after that refusal, her food rations were drastically cut. Matthias suggested that, apparently, the seal had been placed at the same time. But Fiona replied that she already had the seal back then. She decided she didn't care whether she lived or died, which is why she mustered the courage to refuse the perverted prince. If she had given him back then, things would have turned out badly. Luke understood that the prince wouldn't have gotten rid of the sacred relic just because she'd turned him down. Fiona agreed with him. Otherwise, she would have been dead long ago. She finished all the food on the tray. Suddenly, Matthias approached her and offered to remove the chains, since she no longer needed them. Luke was horrified and wanted to stop him because they didn't have permission to do that. Matthias replied that everything was fine and there wouldn't be any problems. He began to unfasten the locks on the chains. Fiona asked if the guys were sure it was okay to remove her chains. Her eyes were filled with fear. Matthias replied seriously that as long as he and Luke were there wouldn't be any problems. Even if the girl tried to do something, they'd be able to stop her right away. Luke was offended by Matthias's words and said he could have phrased it more gently. But the girl replied that she understood everything. Matthias asked if she was full. He offered to bring her more food if she wanted. Fiona thanked him for feeding her and said she was fine. Matthias gave Luke a serious look and silently ordered him to take the tray away. Luke understood. The young man quickly picked up the tray with the empty plates. He turned around, saying it was time for him to get back to work. He said goodbye to them and left to attend to his duties. And so, Matthias and Fiona were left alone in the room. They sat across from each other in large, plush armchairs and talked. Matthias asked the girl to tell him a little more about herself. For example, starting from the moment she was chosen by the sacred relic. Fiona explained that she had been 12 years old at the time, and that it would be a long story. She asked the young man if he was really ready for this long tale. He replied that he was absolutely ready. And Fiona began. The Galjud Empire possesses 3 sacred relics. One of these is a golden bracelet that grants its owner an inexhaustible supply of mana. It is believed that these relics were created by the gods and have existed since time immemorial. But the relics themselves are shrouded in mystery. Each country keeps several relics and carefully conceals any information about them. Only the chosen few can use the relics. For 200 years, the golden bracelet had no owner. Once a year, the Empire holds a ritual where 6-year-old children from all over the country gather. All you have to do is touch the relics, and you can go home. And so, one day, Fiona touched it too. As soon as the golden bracelet chose her, she was immediately sent to the palace. A seal of obedience was placed upon her. If the girl did not obey her master, the prince, the seal would kill her. And from that very day, her life as the Empire's mage began. She couldn't see her family, couldn't go outside without permission. Day after day, Fiona studied magic, eagerly awaiting her monthly meeting with her parents. Every day, she was given all sorts of tasks that she was required to carry out. For example, she might be sent to slay monsters or till the soil. While she toiled like a slave, the prince rested and entertained himself with his mistresses. At the time, Fiona wondered how long it would take for the prince to get bored of his latest woman. Sometimes the prince would summon Fiona right in the middle of his pleasures. At some point, she came to hate the prince with all her heart. And then, one day, the prince told her in a sneering voice that from now on, Fiona would be the one to entertain him. It was an order. He ordered her to kill every single one of them. Fiona resisted and refused. For her disobedience, the prince pushed her down the stairs so that the girl fell and bled to death. She didn't want to do it for anything in the world. The prince was outraged, asking why she was resisting. Did she really want to die? He was very cruel and angry. Half dead, Fiona said she'd rather die than become a murderer. And the prince ordered all the trash to be disposed of, including her. Shortly before the girl turned 18, the day she had never expected arrived. The day her parents died. Fiona wept at their graveside and couldn't come to terms with the death of her mom and dad for a long time. She called out to them tearfully. She was very unhappy. On their way to the palace, her parents were attacked by bandits. At the time, she didn't understand why she was still alive, why she was fighting. She didn't know. She didn't know, but she thought it was all meaningless. Before falling asleep, she remembered the fight with Matthias. At that moment, she thought she would be freed and die. She thought he would cut her in half. And Fiona can't even believe that she's still alive, sitting here with a cup of tea and talking to a guy. And yet, not long ago, Fiona and Matthias were enemies, fighting each other. Matthias crossed his arms over his chest and frowned. And he lowered his head. He replied that everything was clear to him. The guy asked if Fiona had any requests. He added that, of course, they couldn't grant everything. The girl was very surprised by this. Matthias asked what she would like to do now. Fiona thought it was kind of strange to ask a prisoner about her wishes. But she really could ask. Her knees trembled with surprise and excitement. She asked timidly if she could take a shower, and the guy showed her the bathroom. He waited for her by the door. While taking a bath, Fiona washed her hair and complained about how much trouble it caused her. Suddenly, a woman with a short haircut and a magical costume approached Matthias. She asked to come into the bathroom, and the guy let her in. By that time, Fiona had already finished her bath. The woman walked in and cheerfully greeted Fiona, the golden mage. She had heard that the girl had woken up, so she came to visit her. Fiona immediately thought she seemed to know who this was. She greeted her and said that they seemed to have met before. The woman replied that that was correct, and she told her that Fiona had really given them a beating back then. She introduced herself as Layla. The girl was the commander of the 1st Magic Division. They had once cast a weakened offensive spell on each other. Fiona had suspected as much. The The girl assumed that Layla hated her, and she grew sad. She apologized to the woman for causing so much trouble and introduced herself. Matthias was already standing behind her, keeping an eye on the situation. Layla was surprised. She walked up to Matthias and quietly asked, "Who is she?" Because Fiona didn't look anything like that mage, she didn't give off any deadly aura. Matthias confirmed that everything was exactly as she saw it. Layla had intended to argue with her, to complain about her, but now she didn't know what to do. Matthias replied that he himself didn't know how to proceed. Fiona watched the guy and the woman whispering to each other and thought that everyone in this place was very friendly. But Fiona had forgotten about her hair. She politely asked Mr. Matthias to cut her hair to shoulder length. The guy was surprised by the request and asked why she wanted to do that. The girl explained that her hair was getting in the way. She had pulled it up and was holding it with her hand for convenience. Right now, Fiona can't use magic, so she won't be able to dry it. Besides, she only grew it out because the prince ordered her to. Matthias tried to talk her out of it. But suddenly, Layla joined the conversation. She rushed over to Fiona, exclaiming that it was a complete waste of time. Layla touched the girl's face and looked into her eyes. Fiona was a little startled by this, but she thanked her. Layla said kindly that since the girl couldn't dry her hair on her own, she would bring her some magical tools for that a little later. And she added that she could also ask Matthias for help. He would do anything. Matthias grumbled in agreement. The guy walked over to Fiona and told her that he thought it would be too wasteful to cut off such beautiful hair. And so he asked the girl to leave it as it was. Fiona's eyes widened. She was surprised. The girl touched her long hair and lowered her eyes. It was the first time someone other than the prince had complimented her. But this time, she noticed she didn't feel repulsed. She felt happy in that moment, and the compliment really cheered her up. Fiona said that even if she was going to be executed soon anyway, she was glad she'd been able to relax so well. The girl smiled. Layla and Matthias looked at her questioningly, not understanding why she thought she was going to be executed. Fiona hadn't expected that and didn't understand them either. Why were they so surprised by her words? Layla and Matthias stood in front of Fiona, looking at her questioningly. They really wanted an explanation from the girl as to why she thought they were going to execute her. And Layla asked what kind of execution she was talking about. Fiona looked at them in surprise, and they didn't understand each other. Her eyes suddenly grew sad, and her expression turned sorrowful once more. The girl looked very pitiful. Her loose hair fell wearily over her hands. She asked, as it were, what execution they were talking about. Weren't they going to execute her? Because Fiona thought they were mistaking her for a cursed enemy mage due to her actions. And it seemed that Layla realized what was going on at that moment. She turned to Matthias and whispered quietly in his ear. She guessed that the guy hadn't explained anything to the girl. Matthias scratched the back of his head guiltily and quietly replied to Layla that he had been going to tell Fiona everything as soon as she woke up, but hadn't had the chance. He said he really had intended to explain, but it had completely slipped his mind. The man covered his face with his hand and truly felt awkward. Layla replied indignantly that she couldn't believe it. She ran over to Fiona and began to stand up for her. Layla turned to Matthias and shouted that it turned out Fiona had thought all this time that they were going to execute her. She demanded that Matthias now make the effort to tell the girl everything. Layla wagged her finger at him, and she looked truly angry and indignant. And Fiona, to be honest, didn't understand what was expected of her at that moment. She stood there, frightened as a little mouse, while Layla's hand rested on her shoulder, caring yet menacing. The man lowered his head and offered no resistance. Before he began his story, he invited Fiona to sit down in the chair, standing nearby. She sat down fearfully, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. The girl was already prepared for anything. Matthias sat down too, folding his hands wearily in front of him and looking at Fiona with a deep gaze. He said that they weren't going to execute her here, and no one was going to judge her either. The man sounded quite stern and convincing. Fiona's eyes widened in surprise. And all because in the Empire, they could punish you for even the slightest offense. It even happened that a person was executed simply for crossing paths with the Emperor at the wrong time. And Matthias began to explain. Fiona had fainted right in the middle of the battle, so he decided to take her to his estate. They only execute people there for mass murder, or for psychopaths who kill just for their own pleasure. And Fiona, even though she fought against them, didn't kill anyone. Besides, the guy mentioned that Fiona was a bearer of a sacred relic, and it was in their best interest to win her over to their side. For this reason, the kingdom decided to treat Fiona as a respected and honored guest. At that moment, Matthias explained that, for safety reasons, the girl's magical powers had been sealed, and her movements were also restricted. Fiona sat there, listening silently to the guy's explanation, and didn't know how to respond. She certainly hadn't expected to hear that. She still looked frightened and tense. And Matthias got to the point. He confidently and decisively told the girl that if life in the Empire didn't suit her, he would like to offer her a position as a mage in their kingdom. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through the girl's mind. She realized that, in other words, she could settle in this royal mansion and work as a mage, and the curse seal will be placed on her once again. Fiona's eyes grew even sadder than they had been before. Even if Fiona swore an oath of loyalty, no one would believe her anyway, and she understood that. The surest and quickest way would be to bind the girl with a seal. But she no longer wants that kind of life. She's had enough. She wouldn't accept that kind of life. And Matthias reported that such a proposal had been made to him, but he had rejected it. He managed to get around the restrictive restraints Luke had made. Although, Matthias added, there are some who are unhappy with this decision, but he believes they won't cause any problems. Fiona asked Matthias, "Do you really have that much influence?" The young man replied that yes, he did, and credited his lineage for it. That's the difference between countries. Matthias explained that, in addition, he was the bearer of a sacred relic, so his voice was second only to the king's. For Matthias, this sacred relic was a magical sword. The girl continued to sit in astonishment, searching for the right words. But suddenly she realized that she should now address the man as Lord Matthias. But he replied that there was no need for that. The man said that no one in this house really observed formalities with him, and he thought Fiona had already noticed that. The girl recalled this and agreed. Matthias said that until people were convinced the girl posed no threat to the kingdom, he couldn't remove her shackles. But he promised he would try to get permission as soon as possible. The man suggested the girl rest for now. Fiona wanted to timidly ask him something, but couldn't. The guy interrupted her. Matthias asked if she wanted anything. He suddenly became very kind. But there was only one thing Fiona didn't understand. Why was he doing so much for her? And she replied that it seemed he had already asked her that question, and she had already washed up, and she didn't have any other obvious desires. But Matthias thought she would ask for something else. Fiona replied that she had already been given everything she wanted, and since that was the case, she didn't want anything else. The girl sat there pondering the question. She told Matthias that she didn't need anything else. The guy sat there and looked at her silently. Fiona told him she was grateful that they had let her sleep in such a wonderful room, fed her delicious food, and shown her such care. In truth, Fiona admits to herself that there are many things she would like to do and see, perhaps even too many. Meanwhile, Matthias continued to sit there silently and seriously. But that was enough for the girl. She smiled sweetly in gratitude. But Matthias noticed that the girl was holding back a lot, and that if he kept pushing, she would close up even more. He wasn't happy about that. Fiona sat quietly, and so Matthias abruptly said it was time for him to leave. He suggested putting the chains back on her, because she had to be alone from now on, and so she wouldn't pose any danger. The girl obediently agreed and held out her slender arms. Matthias put the chains on her with regret, expressing remorse and apologizing as he did so. He looked very sad, but the girl wasn't sad. She was ready for anything, and he left, slamming the door behind him. Fiona immediately noticed how kind Matthias was and smiled, and yet they had been fighting each other here and there for a whole year. The girl honestly didn't understand why he was so kind to her. She had thought he was scary, but after talking with him, all her fear had vanished. Fiona thought of Luke, of Layla, and couldn't understand why they were all so kind. In her entire life, she had never received as much kindness at once as she had today after waking up. Only her late parents had treated her that way. The girl thought of them. She recalled all the happy moments of her childhood, how they played, walked hand in hand, and had fun. During their rare visits, her mother would worry about whether their daughter was eating well, and her father would say that Fiona only had to tell them, and they would immediately go to the emperor to put him in his place if necessary. They truly worried about their daughter and loved her with all their hearts. When Fiona was little, she would tell her parents that if the emperor heard them, he would get angry. She assured them that everything was fine with her and that she was okay. Her mother looked at her with sad eyes and sympathized. But the two people Fiona loved most are no longer alive, and she will never be able to see them again. Fiona picked up the pillow lying next to her on the sofa and silently began to cry into it, hugging it. Iron chains bound her slender, delicate wrists, and tears rolled down her cheeks. Only then did the girl notice that the pillow in her hands was very luxurious, and she began to blame herself for crying over it. The girl pushed the pillow aside so as not to ruin it. She tried to calm down, and a good idea suddenly popped in her head. Fiona decided that maybe she should get some fresh air. She stood in front of the window, threw it wide open, and looked outside. She was very surprised by what she saw outside. A huge garden square appeared before her, with numerous luxurious fountains. The sound of water from these fountains reached even Fiona, and it soothed her greatly. People were walking everywhere, so many people, Some of them were dressed in robes, some in work uniforms, and some simply in luxurious dresses, suits, finery, and tall hats. Trees were neatly planted everywhere, adding even more beauty to the place. Birds sat and chirped on the lampposts, and the air was filled with the scent of spring flowers. Everyone was rushing somewhere, running, bustling about, and chatting. Fiona sat alone in the room, chained up, stripped of her magical powers. She peered out the small window below and looked at the building. The girl noticed that the mansion she was in was quite tall and large. Everywhere there were columns, towers, luxurious patterns, and ornate details, wide windows, doors, and balconies. Suddenly, Fiona began to wonder. She became curious. What was the king of this country like? Rumor had it that he was a pacifist who hated war. Fiona thought that made him sound like a good person, and judging by how they treated her, she realized the rumors were true. Fiona continued to stand alone on the balcony, watching those around her, breathing in the spring air and regretting her actions. She was sad. She rested her hands wearily on the balcony railing and looked down. Her hair blew beautifully in the wind, but there was nothing but sadness in her eyes. She recalled Matthias's proposal, that he wanted to offer her the position of the kingdom's mage. The girl abruptly lifted her head, looked up at the sky, and fell deep in thought. She shielded her eyes with her hand from the sun's rays that were shining directly into them. Fiona wondered, what would her life have been like if she had been born in this country? She could have fought alongside the people in the government, rested, and spent her free time with them. She wondered if she would have been happy in that situation. Fiona stood on the balcony a little longer and thought about her life. Then she closed the window and turned back into the room where she now lives. She stepped back a little from the window, examining the furniture. Fiona thought that since she was already here, she might as well look around the room. Matthias had told her earlier that she could use everything in the room. Fiona began carefully opening all the drawers and cabinets. In one of the cabinets, she saw something shiny, luxurious, studded with precious stones, resembling a small round box. She picked it up, but immediately thought that she certainly didn't need it, though it looked very beautiful. Then Fiona opened the wardrobe and took out the first dress she came across. It was, in her opinion, luxurious and pleasant to the touch. The girl wondered if she would ever be able to go out on the town wearing something like that. Suddenly, she turned her head, and her gaze fell on a bookshelf. She walked briskly over to the shelf and began examining the books. She felt good knowing that she could now read here. The girl even touched a few books out of curiosity, and she really liked them. Meanwhile, evening had fallen. The girl was sitting on her bed, her hands still shackled with chains that no one had removed. Fiona stretched wearily, already getting ready for bed. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was Matthias. He asked permission to enter, and Fiona didn't resist. Matthias entered with a tray of delicious food, saying he had brought Fiona dinner. The girl thanked him for the food. The man approached her and carefully removed the chains so she could eat. On the tray were 2 large covered bowls with the main dishes, a plate of rolls, salad, fruit, and cutlery. Fiona looked at the tray and thought there was a portion on it for someone else. But Matthias replied seriously that all this food was exclusively for her. The girl was very surprised by this, as she had never seen such a luxurious, delicious spread prepared just for her alone. She was certainly flattered, but it was just too much. Fiona told the guy that she was very grateful, but she couldn't possibly eat that much. The girl smiled shyly. Matthias replied that she could just pick out what she liked and leave the rest. Fiona replied regretfully that she couldn't just waste food like that. The guy convinced her that there was nothing wrong with it, and he would eat whatever was left. Fiona was pleased, but Matthias was second only to the king, and Fiona couldn't bring herself to do such a thing. But she didn't want to throw the food away either. Exactly. The girl told the guy that she didn't want him to finish off her leftovers, but she couldn't just throw the food away either. So, feeling a bit shy, she suggested that Matthias eat with her. The guy was very surprised by this suggestion, but he agreed anyway and didn't resist. The girl thanked him for that, and they sat down at the table, facing each other, and began to eat dinner. Fiona put a chicken steak on her plate and really enjoyed the taste. Matthias asked if she liked it, and the girl replied that the crust was very crispy and the meat just melted in her mouth. She smiled and was happy. The guy was eating too and told her she shouldn't hold back and could eat as much as she wanted. Fiona thanked him again and said he should try the chicken too. Matthias agreed and picked up a knife. They ate and enjoyed themselves. Matthias really liked the meat too, and Fiona was happy for him as well. After dinner, the girl happily told the man that it had been a long time since she'd eaten like this with anyone. Matthias, wiping his hands, remembered that Fiona had taken a bath that morning. He suggested she take another bath in the evening, but the girl was afraid. She replied that she was fine as she was and that she didn't sweat much. But then she would definitely have to take a bath in the morning. She asked Matthias what she should do, and she thought to herself that this would clearly cause them a lot of trouble. Matthias assured her that she could take a bath whenever she wanted. But today, as he understood it, Fiona just needed to change clothes. He was holding the key in his hands. Fiona replied that yes, indeed, that was the case. But she wouldn't be able to change with the chain on. So she asked Matthias to come back to her before she went to bed. The girl suddenly ran off to get changed. The guy didn't have time to stop her and remained standing in her room, next to the table and the empty plates from dinner. Matthias could come here as often as he needed to, but he realized he wouldn't be able to come at night. The guy touched his neck guiltily and fell into thought, lowering his gaze. The next morning, Fiona woke up looking a little disheveled. It was her second day in captivity. The girl's hair was carelessly gathered into a long braid and tousled in all directions after sleeping. Her eyes were heavy, and she walked around, stretching, half asleep. Matthias knocked on the door and asked if he could come in. Fiona opened the door for him, looking disheveled and tired, and the guy came in. With her eyes half open and vacant, Fiona wished the guy good morning and yawned a lot. Matthias was, as always, dressed in a neat, ironed white shirt and business slacks, his hair perfectly combed, looking his best, as befits a member of the royal family. He immediately noticed that Fiona had only just woken up, so he offered to bring breakfast a little later. Half asleep, Fiona quietly but firmly replied with her eyes closed that she wanted to eat. The young man gave her permission to freshen up first. He added seriously that she could certainly use a wash. A short while later, plates of breakfast were already on the table. They held various pastries, berries, toast with butter, sausages, and boiled eggs. Everything looked very tasty, appetizing, and overall, perfect and beautiful. Fiona freshened up, washed her face, and brushed her hair. She applied some light makeup, smoothed her hair, and styled it into a neat, low bun. She looked at her breakfast and said with a happy smile that everything she loved was on that table. Matthias smiled too and replied that he had made a point of remembering that. Fiona mentioned that they had brought a lot of food again. She asked if he was going to eat with her again. He replied that that was the plan. He was already holding another tray of food. Fiona smiled and thanked him, saying she was glad. Matthias accepted her thanks, and they began to eat dessert, milk porridge with honey. Fiona added honey to her bowl of porridge. Matthias mentioned that they also had berry syrup. But when he saw the honey, he figured the syrup wasn't needed anymore and set it aside. But Fiona suddenly asked him for the syrup to add it along with the honey. The guy was a little surprised. She had, of course, told him she had a sweet tooth, but Matthias admitted he hadn't realized she loved sweets that much. Fiona ate the porridge with honey and syrup with relish and replied that she simply adored sweets. Matthias watched her eat, and he realized he needed to add more sweets to the menu. He was doing all this for his guest. They continued to eat breakfast and chat. After breakfast, Matthias mentioned that the weather was nice today and suggested they go for a walk, although they could only go out into the garden. Fiona was surprised and asked again if she was really allowed to go outside. The young man replied that, of course, she could only go out if he accompanied her. He was already dressed in his knight's uniform. Fiona was delighted and once again thanked Matthias for his kindness. They got ready and left the room. Matthias immediately took the table with the trays and carried it to the kitchen so the staff could wash them and tidy up. Fiona bowed to one of the kitchen workers and sincerely thanked her for the delicious breakfast. This kind old woman, who worked in the kingdom's kitchen, gave Fiona some candy as a token of appreciation. They waved warmly to each other and went outside with Matthias. During their walk, they saw other knights, and Fiona bowed to them as a sign of greeting and respect. They strolled among flowering bushes, garden trees, and fountains, breathing in the spring air. Fiona wondered why no one was looking at her with disgust, even though a large number of people had already passed by them. She turned to Matthias. The girl noticed that his clothes were a different color compared to the other knights. She assumed this was because of Matthias's high status. The young man confirmed this and replied that it was indeed the case. He explained that, unfortunately, he had to decline the offer to become the official head of the knightly order. So they decided to simply grant him the same powers as the head. Matthias looked a little displeased. He didn't like talking about it. Fiona supported him and understood that it was really hard for him. She said that if his uniform set him apart from the other knights, it suited him very well. A smile lit up the girl's face. Matthias smiled too and asked if she really thought so. She replied that she did, and he sincerely thanked her. Then the two continued their walk. Fiona looked up at the sky and fell deep in thought again. Only 2 days had passed since she woke up here, but she could already tell that this was a good kingdom. The next day, Fiona fell ill. Matthias thought she had taken her bed because of overexertion. The girl lay in her bed, slept a lot, ate nothing, and hardly moved. Matthias took care of her, brought her medicine, dampened a cloth, and placed it on her forehead. He asked the healers about Fiona's condition. One of the healers, an elderly man of short stature, said that fatigue must have finally taken its toll on her body. The healers, could heal her wounds, but they were powerless to cure her fever. The healer asked Matthias to make sure Fiona took the medicine he had prescribed and got plenty of rest. Matthias remembered everything and helped the girl recover. Whenever she asked for water, he never refused her request and brought her a drink. He even carried her in his arms to the bathroom, so she wouldn't strain herself unnecessarily and further damage her health. He waited outside, faithful and devoted, helping from the bottom of his heart, asking for nothing in return. When Fiona was asleep, Matthias waited patiently outside her door, sitting on the floor, and he checked her temperature. He placed a wet washcloth on her forehead to make her feel better. In her sleep, Fiona cried and often called for her mother. She had nightmares. At such times, Matthias didn't wake her. Instead, he gently and quietly wiped the tears from her delicate cheeks so she wouldn't wake up. He felt sorry for her. Then, after a while, Fiona began to get better. Matthias gave her fruit ice cream and crushed ice to eat. He fed her with a spoon. The girl sat there, and she told him that the ice cream was very tasty, and she sincerely thanked the guy for his help and support. Matthias carefully fed Fiona, making sure she ate every last spoonful of ice cream. The girl smiled and was happy, but Matthias caught himself thinking that he couldn't hold back his emotions. He felt sad. The next morning, Fiona woke up and Matthias was right there beside her. He touched her forehead to check how she was feeling, and he realized that her fever had gone down and there was no longer any need to worry about it. The guy continued to feed Fiona soup with a spoon. Before giving her the soup, he blew on it so it wouldn't be too hot and so the girl wouldn't burn herself. Fiona was already full of energy, healthier, and more lively. She sincerely thanked the guy for his help, and she added that she could eat on her own now. The guy didn't insist or object. He handed her a bowl and spoon and simply watched her. The girl finished all the soup and felt good. Before bedtime, when Fiona was already lying in bed, Matthias sat next to her bed and read books to her. He showed her the utmost care and comfort. Fiona realized that Matthias had always been by her side all this time, and she had no chains then, which definitely made her happy. Matthias believed that illness was easier to bear when someone was nearby. That was the reason for his care. After all, he himself had never had that since childhood. Then Fiona woke up. Matthias asked how she was feeling. He asked her kindly if she'd like to have a cold, sweet snack. Fiona said yes and smiled. She wasn't wearing the chains at that moment because the guy was nearby, keeping watch. But now, before leaving, he put the chains back on. Matthias replied that in that case, he would go get her a snack, come back quickly, and take off the chains. Fiona didn't think he needed to worry so much about it. She was perfectly fine sitting in chains and waiting patiently for him. A few minutes later, Matthias brought her a serving of cold, sweet pudding in a pretty bowl, along with a spoon. Fiona began to eat the dessert while sitting in bed, and Matthias sat in a chair next to the bed and watched her. He reminded her not to forget to rinse her mouth with water after eating, or else she might get cavities. Fiona was about to put another spoonful of ice cream in her mouth and didn't argue with his request. She could see how concerned and sincere he was. After that, she fell asleep again and dreamed about her childhood. The next day, Fiona had fully recovered. Matthias also noticed that her fever seemed to have completely subsided. Fiona was sitting on the couch, reading a book she'd taken from the bookshelf in her room. Matthias walked over to Fiona and asked if anything still hurt. He offered to remove any food from her diet if necessary. The girl replied that the only thing that hurt was her throat, so for now she asked him to remove all spicy foods from her diet. The man understood her request and was about to comply. He brought her a small bowl of candies that looked like little hard candies. The guy said these candies should help soothe her sore throat and suggested Fiona try them. The girl was very happy with the new sweet treat. She thanked Matthias and said the candies were very pretty. Fiona tried one candy, and she noticed that they were honey-flavored. She liked them. Matthias also began to smile modestly and gently, because he was happy to see the girl happy. He said that Fiona could eat as many as she wanted, because he could bring her more later. Fiona thanked him again. Matthias politely said goodbye and mentioned that he still had things to do today, so it was time for him to leave. And he left the room. A little while later, Luke came into Fiona's room. He kind of checked on her and asked in a cheerful voice if she was feeling better. The girl replied that she was perfectly fine and thanked the guy for asking about her condition. Luke was very energetic, cheerful, full of energy and positivity. He replied that that was great, but he immediately noticed the bowl of candy sitting on the couch next to Fiona. His eyes widened in surprise. Luke asked about it and wondered if Matthias had left those candies there by accident. An interesting smile appeared on his face. Luke suspected something, but Fiona sat there, not understanding why Luke had asked about the candy in such a strange way. She even set her book aside. Fiona replied that she had told Matthias her throat was sore, and Matthias had brought her this candy. Luke was stunned, and it showed on his face. Fiona grew worried. She suddenly asked the guy if the candies were terribly expensive. Luke was a little flustered at first, but replied that no, they were the most ordinary candies you could buy at any store. He told the girl not to be shy and to eat as many as she wanted, and smiled awkwardly. After all, the main thing was for Fiona's throat to get better. Fiona found something strange about this, and Luke realized he couldn't. He couldn't very well tell Fiona that these candies were an incredibly rare and expensive item, usually available only to the rulers of countries. Luke was sure that if Fiona found out, she wouldn't eat them, and it would be a shame to waste these candies on a simple sore throat. Luke couldn't keep his mouth shut. He immediately worried. What would happen if Matthias found out? Luke forced himself to think that he hadn't seen anything, and he kept repeating that phrase over and over, standing next to Fiona. But Luke hadn't expected Matthias to get so carried away. He just said out loud by accident. Fiona heard him and asked, "What did Luke say?" The guy wriggled out of it and replied that he hadn't said anything. And he kept thinking. Until now, Matthias hadn't cared at all about girls, no matter how much they fawned over him. And for Fiona's sake, he'd gone this far. Luke, to be honest, was a little taken aback by Matthias's enthusiasm. But the guy wanted this girl to be happy. Luke humbly lowered his head and decided to watch the whole situation unfold from the sidelines for now. Time passed. Things changed. Fiona and Matthias were still getting along very well and getting along with each other. They spent time together, had breakfast and dinner together. 2 weeks have passed since Fiona arrived in this kingdom. She eats and reads books in her room. Sometimes she plays cards with Matthias. The girl goes for walks, eats in the garden, and goes to sleep with a peaceful mind. And then she wakes up happy the next morning. But Fiona knows one thing. No matter how much they spoil her, she begged them to let her clean up after herself so she wouldn't be a burden to them at all. But all the cleaning supplies they gave her were so luxurious that Fiona felt bad using them. After all, she was still a captive, and she was anxious about whether she was even allowed to enjoy life here. Matthias answered the girl's questions and concerns with a serious and confident voice, assuring her that she could. But he had a lot of work today, so he asked Luke to look after her. His Majesty suddenly decided to invite Fiona to an audience. Matthias told her that Luke would accompany her, and he hoped she didn't mind. Fiona replied that she didn't mind. Everything was fine. They sat at the table and had breakfast together once again, enjoying the most delicious food in the kingdom. To tell the truth, Matthias would have liked to accompany Fiona himself, but he was sure that the old raccoon had deliberately scheduled the meeting for a day when the guy wouldn't be around. Matthias was angry. Fiona asked, "Who is the old raccoon?" She put on a special women's outfit, a long dark skirt, a white blouse with ruffles, and a large bow on the collar. She gathered her hair into a neat low bun, leaving the front strands loose. This was the standard formal attire for women in their country. After changing, Fiona went out to Matthias, who was waiting for her outside. He was already dressed in knight's armor and completely ready. The girl asked if she had put on the blouse with the bow correctly. Matthias looked at her and asked her to stand up straight, and he decided to adjust her bow, touching it lightly. The young man straightened her collar and smoothed out the shoulder pads of her blouse. The girl thanked him for his help. After that, Matthias left the room and went about his business. Immediately, Luke knocked on the door. He was supposed to look after Fiona while Matthias was away. They greeted each other cheerfully. Fiona told him she was counting on him. Luke invited her to set off and put a magical relic bracelet on her. They left the room and went out onto the street. The two walked past tall, imposing columns, ornate gardens, plants, and flowers. Fiona enjoyed the fresh air and the kingdom's surroundings. Luke told her that they were almost to the castle. They stopped, and the guy noticed and said that Fiona didn't seem nervous at all. The girl replied that getting nervous wouldn't help her here, and laughed. Luke smiled and said she was right. Then they reached the castle doors. And immediately after entering, Luke and Fiona found themselves in the royal hall. There, seated on the throne, was the king, an elderly man, very serious and imposing. The royal hall was magnificent. Tall columns, light-colored walls, large, spacious windows, diamond chandeliers, and high balconies above the staircases. Everywhere, male guards stood at attention, protecting his majesty. Luke immediately bowed low before the king, while Fiona stood there feeling very awkward, unsure of what she was supposed to do. Her expression was a mix of fear and embarrassment. The king said in a serious voice that he was pleased to meet the Golden Mage. He was referring to Fiona. He immediately introduced himself, saying his name was Dykehard and that he was the ruler of this country. The man asked Luke to rise from his knees. Luke stood up, and in that moment, he playfully winked at Fiona. The girl didn't understand the gesture, but tried to compose herself. She too bowed slightly to the king in return. Fiona said it was a great honor for her to meet His Majesty and introduced herself. There was a hint of fear and shyness in Fiona's eyes, but she was ready for anything. Luke's eyes were calm and, as always, cheerful. The king's gaze, however, was confident and serious. He even gave the young people a slight smile. Fiona noticed that the king and Luke looked very much alike, and the king immediately announced that the boy was his nephew and called him not Luke, but Eddie Luke. Fiona was surprised by this news, and she realized that this meant Luke had royal ancestry. She leaned toward the boy and whispered to him about his name, Eddie Luke. But the boy replied that he wasn't Eddie Luke anymore, and she could call him by his old name. And Fiona realized that Luke really wasn't lying, and neither was the king. The girl moved a little closer to the king. The man began his speech. He said that Matthias had told him a lot about her, but this was the first time they were meeting in person. The king asked the girl for permission to ask her a couple of questions. Fiona moved a little closer to the king's throne and agreed that the king could ask her anything. And the man asked Fiona to tell him what was happening within the Galjude Empire. And the girl began her story. The conflict between the empire and the kingdom began about a year ago. Previously, peace had reigned between the two countries, but the emperor fell ill and was succeeded by Crown Prince Gilbert. After that, relations between the countries began to deteriorate. The greedy prince planned to use his power over the bearer of the sacred relic to seize the country's rich lands. Fiona explained that she and other mages were sent to places where protective and magical stones, the foundation for creating armor and weapons, were mined. They were sent there to steal these stones. Over time, the kingdom strengthened its defenses, and the battles grew increasingly fierce. The peace-loving kingdom sent letters to the emperor many times, expressing their dissatisfaction with the empire's behavior. But the empire simply ignored them and continued its plundering. The king folded his arms across his chest, and he asked about the empire's prince. He was curious to know what kind of person he was. Fiona, without hesitation, replied that the prince was an arrogant, power-hungry, and ruthless man, and a pervert, a real scum. The king was a little surprised. Fiona wanted other countries to know what a maniac the prince really was. The king had heard that Fiona had no warm feelings toward this empire, and he asked if that was true. The girl replied that it was indeed true. She had no reason to be loyal to the empire. She said that her hometown was dear to her, but no one was waiting for her there anymore. The girl remembered with sadness her late parents, who loved her very much, and whom she loved very much. Tears began to well up in her eyes. The king realized that she no longer wanted to go back there. Fiona replied that she didn't really want to go back there. The king fell silent. After a brief pause, he asked the girl a question. He asked what she thought of Matthias. Fiona was very surprised, but tried not to show it and to keep her emotions in check. Her eyes widened, and her face turned pale. She couldn't understand why the man was asking her such a thing. But this was a question from the king himself, so Fiona had to think carefully about her answer. And that much she understood. She replied that Matthias had always taken care of her, and that she felt warmth and safety when she was with him, just like with her mom. Fiona looked down sadly. But suddenly Luke, who was standing nearby, burst out laughing. He covered his face with his hand and laughed at the word mom. Fiona turned to the guy and asked if she had said something funny. The king chuckled a little too. He said he even felt sorry for Matthias. Fiona thought about it. Pity, indeed, she thought. It must be humiliating for any man to be compared to his mom. And maybe it would have been better to mention her dad instead of her mom. But to the girl, mom just sounded more right. She felt very sad and ashamed as she lowered her head. In her mind, the girl apologized to Matthias for humiliating him like that. Fiona asked the king not to tell Matthias about this situation. The king smiled, agreed, and promised he wouldn't tell anyone. And all the other subjects would keep quiet as well. All the guards bowed to the king in agreement. Fiona also bowed to the king and the subjects as a sign of gratitude. She realized she needed to be more careful and not blurt something like that out to Matthias right to his face. The audience with the king ended, and Luke and Fiona left the royal hall. The young man told her in a cheerful voice that she had done well. But before heading back, he asked to step away to the restroom for 5 minutes and apologized. He asked Fiona to wait for him there. The girl obediently agreed and didn't resist. Luke apologized to her again and put chains on her wrists. He explained that she needed to be restrained again for a short while for safety's sake. Fiona didn't resist again and understood everything. But a minute later, she suddenly fell to the floor due to a moment of carelessness. Luke had already left. The girl realized that the seal was draining her strength so much that she couldn't even stand up. The cursed seals were overwhelming her. The girl was a little angry. She sat there, sad with her head bowed, wishing the guy would hurry back from the restroom. Suddenly, a man approached her. He was wearing a black shirt and black business pants. He had dark, slick-back hair, a menacing gaze, and a sly grin. The girl looked at him and realized that this man looked familiar to her. Could it be that they had fought him before? She greeted the man, waiting to see what he would do next. He said nothing, and suddenly he reached out his hand toward her, but not to help her. Fiona was startled. He used magic to blast a powerful jet of water at her from his palm, and he laughed. Fiona, soaking wet, hadn't expected such a move. The man leaned toward her and declared that without magic, she was just a weak woman. She looked up at him with a pleading expression, but then she remembered something. This man was the one who used to constantly attack her with water, but she had easily fended off his attacks. Subjects, castle workers, and strangers passed by them. Fiona told the man she had a small request for him. He became interested, crossing his arms over his chest and smiling again with his sinister grin. Fiona began asking him to clean up the excess water because people passing by might slip. Her voice was very plaintive and polite. The man got angry and replied that if that's what she wanted, she should clean it up herself. The girl replied that he was right, but she added that if she went to get a rag, she would only spread the water even further, and she asked for advice on what she should do. The man remained silent in anger because the situation was driving him crazy. Meanwhile, Luke returned from the restroom. He immediately rushed over to help Fiona and yelled at the man. The man's name was Graham. Luke turned to him and angrily asked what the hell he was doing there. The guy stood in front of Fiona and ordered Graham to clean up all the water right away. Graham yelled back and said that Luke was being very loud and that he was going to clean up the water anyway. He waved his arms in anger and shouted. The water disappeared. Luke helped Fiona get up from the floor and brush herself off, then remove the chains. The girl introduced herself to Graham and said she was pleased to meet him. Graham just smirked and walked away with a displeased look on his face. Before leaving, he said spitefully that Fiona was strange. Luke and Fiona stood rooted to the spot, utterly surprised by his words. Fiona got upset, covered her face with her hands, and asked the guy if she really was strange. Luke replied that the only strange one here was Graham. The girl wanted to make sure if that was true, and Luke replied that it was true. After that, they went down to the first floor, closer to the entrance. They found themselves among a large crowd of people walking down the stairs. Luke turned to Fiona and apologized to her for leaving her here alone. He hadn't thought Graham would manage to find her, let alone dare to attack her. Fiona replied that it was no big deal and asked him not to worry about it. In that case, Luke suggested they go back to the room, and she agreed. A delicious meal was already waiting on a tray in the room. Rolls, muffins, jam-filled buns, and cups of tea. The two sat down at the table and began to eat. Fiona took a cupcake. She mentioned that she'd heard this building was the residence of the court magicians. She asked Luke if he lived there. Luke replied that he lived on the second floor. Across from them was the knight's quarters, and Matthias lived there. He told the girl that she had been assigned a VIP room, but she had suspected as much. Earlier, she had asked Matthias to move her to a simpler room, but he told her not to worry about it. Fiona said that everyone here was very kind to her, but she didn't understand this kindness. Luke reminded her that someone had just poured a whole bucket of water over her head, and he asked why she still thought that way. The girl replied that, after all, this man was the first one to show her even a shred of hostility, and it seemed more normal to her that they would want to pour water on her. But everything became clear to Luke. He said that, after all, no one had ever died in a battle against Fiona. She allowed severely wounded mages and knights to retreat, and she even hindered the advance of the Imperial mages, who were supposed to be her allies. And Luke added that everyone here knows what Fiona did. The girl was surprised. How? After all, she had deliberately changed the color of her magic. She used white instead of gold to hide the fact that she was the one who did it. Fiona was sure that no one would ever find out. Luke admitted that it was Matthias who had figured her out. And when they captured Fiona, Matthias told everyone the truth. They had long been wondering what was going on, so it was easy for Matthias to convince everyone he was right. Fiona was tense, but she understood everything and felt a little upset. It finally dawned on her why Layla had been so kind to her back then. Even people passing by didn't show her any hostility. Of course, this was more pleasant for the girl than being their enemy, but she realized they had figured her out and covered her face with her hands to hide her emotions. During another breakfast together, Matthias suggested that Fiona go for a walk in the city. The girl was very surprised by this suggestion. She put on her best summer dress just for the occasion, a sleeveless, knee-length dress, braided her long hair, and slipped on a pair of light ankle boots. She told Matthias that she had long dreamed of visiting the city. He was already ready. The guy asked if Fiona had brought a handkerchief. The girl replied that the handkerchief was in her pocket. Matthias was concerned that Fiona was dressed too lightly for a walk. but she replied that it was warm outside today, and the guy said that wouldn't do. He explained that even if it was warm today, it would start getting cold quickly by evening. Matthias asked Fiona to take something to throw on with her. The girl didn't argue and went back to the dressing room. She noticed that Matthias was acting like a mom today, too. The guy asked if she wanted to try on any accessories. He added that she could use the ones in her jewelry box. He asked if she liked them or not. Fiona thought for a moment. In her opinion, the accessories were very beautiful, and she even wanted to wear them, but they looked expensive, and Fiona couldn't wear something like that. In the end, after thinking for a moment, Fiona replied to Matthias that she was already wearing a pretty nice dress, so she could do without jewelry. There were so many beautiful things in the box that it was hard for Fiona to choose just one. Besides, she had never worn anything like that before. Matthias thought for a moment too and realized that the girl was feeling shy. The guy took matters into his own hands. He opened a box and took out a single hair clip. Turning to Fiona, the hairpin was long, studded with gemstones, shimmering with a golden glow, and very luxurious. Matthias pinned it to the side of the girl's hair, neatly sweeping it away from her face. The guy said that this hairpin was pretty enough and not too flashy. He added that she could always take it out at any time. He was certain of one thing. Considering where Matthias and Fiona were going, it was better not to wear anything that could easily fall off. Fiona adjusted the hairpin, and she began to smile sweetly. She didn't take it out and agreed with the guy, and so they decided to head out. The weather outside was clear and sunny, with not a cloud in the sky. When they arrived in the city, Fiona began to marvel at the local beauty and color. Everywhere there were shop windows, small houses, and various stores selling a wide variety of items. Everywhere there were benches, cafes, and signs. People were walking all around, hurrying somewhere. During their walk, Matthias asked the girl if she wanted to go somewhere. She replied that she was willing to go anywhere, and so they came to the market. Fiona immediately saw a variety of vegetables, fruits, and various goods, and was very happy to see them. The couple filled their bags with purchases. Cucumbers, tomatoes, and mushrooms were everywhere. And nearby was a dessert stand, with all kinds of donuts, cupcakes, and buns. Fiona said she wanted to carry the bags and help Matthias. But he didn't let her and took all the bags and packages himself. After a while, they arrived at the park and sat down on a bench. The group decided to have a snack with what they had recently bought at the market and the corner store. The girl took out a pancake with chicken and vegetables and enjoyed it. She told Matthias that it was her first time eating something like that. Her face looked very pleased. Matthias sat next to her, looked at her, and smiled too. He asked Fiona to eat more slowly, not to rush, and noticed that she had gotten a sauce stain on her cheek because she wasn't careful. The guy gently wiped the stain away with his hand, and Fiona smiled even more broadly and blushed. Then, after they had a bite to eat, they went to a cafe. It was located in a large, beautiful building with windows and was quite unusual. Matthias had reserved a table there in advance and taken care of everything. They were greeted by a female receptionist, who smiled as she showed them to their reserved table. Matthias stood there looking at Fiona, who was already on cloud nine. After all, it was a cat cafe. Cats, black, ginger, and striped, were walking all over the shelves, sofas, and tables, meowing and purring, delighting the visitors. A black kitten immediately jumped onto Fiona's lap and began to rub against her. The girl was very happy, but afraid to touch the cat. She and Matthias were sitting across from each other at a table. He told her that she was free to pet and touch all the cats. Fiona gently began to scratch its face and be happy. The cat was also happy to be near her. She called him a cutie. Meanwhile, Matthias admired Fiona, sipped his tea, and thought that she was just as cute as the cat. The couple quickly finished their tea at the cafe, played with the cats, chatted with each other, and had a fun time. The female manager thanked them for visiting, and the group left the cafe and went out onto the street. Fiona said that she liked all animals, but she loved cats the most. She explained that this was exactly why she was so happy when she found out that Matthias had booked a table at this very cafe. The guy replied that it made him happy and smiled at her. He realized that he hadn't been watching Fiona all this time for nothing and had noticed that she had a special love for cats. She read books about cats and wore a scarf with cats on it. And he was sure that if he had asked Fiona directly, she would have definitely refused. But everything turned out wonderfully. The couple returned to that bench in the park, and they put all their things there. Matthias told Fiona that he needed to take care of something at the office and asked her to wait for him there with the bags. Fiona didn't resist and obediently agreed to wait for him. She had already held out her arms so he could put the safety chains on her, as usual. But today Matthias said they could do without the chain, and he was completely calm. The girl was a little surprised, but happy, and he said goodbye, turned around, and left. Fiona wondered if Matthias was really allowed to do that. After all, she couldn't cause him any trouble at work. The girl sat down on a bench and looked up at the sky. She felt a little lonely on her own. She thought that she could run away somewhere without the chains, break the spell, and hide, and have fun with the cat she adored so much. She wondered if everything was really okay now. 10 minutes later, Matthias returned and asked with a smile if Fiona had been waiting for him. She replied that very little time had passed, and she hadn't waited a single moment. The guy picked up the bags, and they continued their walk. Fiona asked curiously, "Where are we going now?" And Matthias led them to the city's main library. Fiona was surprised by how large the library was and began to look around and explore it. Matthias told the female librarian that he needed to find a couple of books. She promised to keep an eye out for something for him. The guy told Fiona that she could move around the library freely, but forbade her from going beyond its walls. The girl obeyed him and, pleased, went on her way. They walked between the aisles and bookshelves. Fiona picked up a few books and was genuinely interested in the literature she found, since she loved reading very much. She sat down at a table to examine the books more closely. Matthias was also looking for books that interested him and was examining them closely. They were having a pretty good time. Fiona felt free and was enjoying herself. But one thing bothered her. She had never had anything like a day off before. But ever since she had arrived in this country, every day had been a day off. But she began to worry. Could a prisoner of war like her really enjoy such a luxury? And there were still no chains on her wrists. She wanted to start helping the people of the kingdom as soon as possible. Fiona was sure she would be useful, even without the sacred relic. Even the best magic teachers in the Empire praised Fiona and said they had nothing left to teach her. The girl truly already had enough knowledge and skills. She clenched her hand into a fist. And if she had magic, then this time, she wants to use it for the good of others. An hour later, Matthias approached her and told her it was time for them to head home. In his hands were several books he wanted to take with him. And the boy asked Fiona if she wanted to take anything with her too. The girl found a book about cats that she really liked, and Matthias let her take it. He said he was going to go fill out some paperwork for now and suggested that Fiona look for a couple more books if she wanted to. And so they returned to the kingdom. They had a lot of fun today. There were lots of boxes and bags with purchases and gifts in Fiona's room. Matthias told the girl that it was all hers, and she could use all these things however she wanted. Fiona was very surprised because she thought Matthias had bought all of this for himself. But the guy replied that it was all for her. After all, there was no way to return it now, so Fiona had to either accept it all or throw it away. The girl looked at all the purchases and realized that Matthias had bought her everything she'd liked that day. Every single item and every single treat. She walked over to him and smiled sincerely, thanking him for it. Matthias smiled back at her. And the next day, Fiona had a second audience with the king scheduled. The girl was already dressed for it, just like last time, wearing a traditional formal women's costume and pulling her hair back into an elegant low bun. Fiona asked Matthias to give her outfit a thumbs up, and he replied that everything looked fine. He was ready too, wearing his knight's armor. He told her he thought the king would ask Fiona today if she wanted to become one of his court mages, but warned her that she could always refuse. Fiona was surprised. She had thought they brought her here precisely so she could become a mage of the kingdom. She asked him about it, but Matthias replied that while they would like that, Fiona wasn't obligated to do it against her will, and he wouldn't let anyone force her, so she could honestly answer the king. Matthias added that from now on, she would live only as she herself wished. The girl's eyes widened in surprise. She realized that Matthias truly cared deeply about her wishes. At that very moment, Luke burst into Fiona's room, swung the door open with a smile, and greeted her, and immediately asked her politely to give him her hand. He removed the magical seal from her wrists and said that now they could go. To be honest, Fiona was worried that people might be able to read her thoughts. But thanks to Matthias, every day of hers feels like a dream. Fiona is so happy that she wants to help the guy in any way she can, and her desire grows stronger and stronger. They arrived at the royal palace and found themselves once again before the king. Fiona, Luke, and Matthias bowed to his majesty. The king immediately turned to the girl and said that she had previously told him she had no warm feelings toward the empire. He asked if her answer had changed. Fiona politely replied that her answer had not changed. Nothing bound her to the empire. Then, the king offered her the chance to swear allegiance to their kingdom and become a court mage. His expression was entirely serious. Fiona clenched her fists, and she replied that she was ready. She was full of determination. The girl wants to do what she does best. Luke and Matthias stood nearby and smiled. But Fiona immediately told the king that she didn't want to go against her principles. Therefore, she asked him not to bind her with a cursed seal that could force her. After all, if Fiona were forced to do something against her will again, she would rather die right then and there. As long as she has the chance to help Matthias and the others, she's fine with everything. And the king understood her. He said he had no objections, but his only requirement was that she remain loyal to the country. The man asked if she would be able to get along with their mages and knights. Fiona replied that she hadn't had many chances to interact with them, but she wanted to be more useful to them. Luke and Layla had been very kind to her, and Matthias had helped her in many ways. Sometimes Fiona even felt that they were spoiling her too much. And then Luke was horrified and realized things were bad. He realized Fiona should stop now and keep quiet. But the girl said she was sincerely grateful to Matthias because he had always been so kind and looked out for her, just like Mom. And Fiona covered her mouth with her hand. It just slipped out. Matthias heard it and turned to go back. Luke burst out laughing. The king heard it too and smiled slightly. He announced that now that they had all come to an agreement, they were free to go. With empty, frightened eyes, the girl bowed to the king in farewell. She didn't know what to do now. Matthias was already getting ready to leave. After all, that was the last thing she wanted to say. Luke apologized to her, smiled, and said it was all his fault. Before leaving, Luke slightly adjusted the cursed seal instead of removing it. The seal was meant to force the girl to answer all the king's questions truthfully. Fiona was horrified. She was glad she had managed to earn His Majesty's trust, but she didn't want to hurt Matthias. Luke said that the stamp was no longer needed and promised to take care of it. Fiona asked him to wait a moment and went to get Matthias. She stopped him and spoke to him. The girl apologized to him. After all, it must be humiliating for a man to hear himself being compared to his mother. Matthias turned to her and looked at her silently. Fiona explained to him that she hadn't meant anything bad. She just wanted to say that the guy had really cared for her. But Matthias only replied dryly that he understood. Fiona told him that she felt warmth and safety when she was with him. And besides, he was so wonderful, handsome, and strong. And Matthias's voice, in her opinion, was so gentle. Fiona declared that she loved all of that about him. And it dawned on Matthias. He turned around and asked her again, did she really love that about him? And Fiona replied that yes, she did. She confessed that of all the people she had ever met, she liked Matthias the most. And she smiled her sweet smile. Matthias smiled slightly at her confession too. Fiona assured him that it wasn't a lie. After all, the curse seal that forced her to speak only the truth was still upon her. Luke stood behind her and confirmed the girl's words. Matthias stood there and replied kindly that, since Fiona liked him more than anyone else, he would be fine with the role of a mother. And he didn't think it was anything humiliating. Fiona asked if he really felt that way, and she remembered that the king had taken pity on him. Matthias asked Fiona not to worry about the king, because that old man couldn't think like ordinary people. And the girl accepted it. But she wanted to add something about Luke, that he had laughed too, but Luke immediately intervened and asked everyone to go into the room so that no one would find out. And Matthias fell into thought. Even if Fiona didn't see him as a man, everything suited him just fine now. The three of them went into Fiona's room. They removed the bracelet from her. But the guys told her that for now, they couldn't remove the bracelet from her right hand, but they would free her left hand. And they wouldn't need the chain anymore either. They told the girl that she could now move freely throughout the kingdom. Fiona was surprised and asked why. Matthias replied that she had been deemed harmless and had no intention of escaping. Fiona realized it was all because of the incident during their walk. After all, they had already left her alone several times. She replied that she understood. Matthias explained that, first and foremost, he simply wanted to take her into town. Luke smirked and muttered that no one doubted that. After all, before this, Matthias had just been hanging around the office. It became clear to Fiona that she now had her freedom. She didn't really need it. And yet, it meant that she and Matthias would see each other less often. The girl looked down sadly. Matthias also said sadly that he'd been assigned shifts again, so he really wouldn't be able to stop by as often. But they could still have dinner and breakfast together. And Matthias was thinking of visiting Fiona on his days off, if she didn't mind. The girl was delighted and replied that she didn't mind at all, thanking him. From now on, Fiona decided she would do everything in her power to become a mage who could be of use to this country. The next morning, Fiona woke up. Starting today, she was a royal mage. The girl put on her magical robe and headed off to class. She arrived at the first training ground for mages. By then, all the mages who were ready to practice had gathered, serious-looking boys and girls in robes. Fiona arrived feeling a little nervous because of all the strangers. She was afraid they would hate her. Layla was with them and kept an eye on everything. She told everyone that starting today, Fiona was joining them. Layla asked the group to get along because Fiona was no longer their enemy. As a gesture of introduction, the girl bowed and introduced herself to everyone. And Layla warned everyone that anyone who hurt the girl would get a scolding from her. But the guys weren't very happy to see her. One of the guys grumbled that it was a hassle. The girls looked at Fiona with indignant expressions. Fiona asked everyone to forgive her for all the trouble she had caused earlier and said that, if possible, she would like to be of use to them all. She had a polite smile on her face. She hoped everyone would get along with her. But the guys didn't picture Fiona that way. Layla announced that they would start with a run. She ordered everyone to run 30 laps around the field. The woman approached Fiona and allowed her to run as much as she could because she had been locked up for a long time and hadn't exercised. Fiona agreed. Everyone, including Fiona, set off running. Physical training and knowledge of combat techniques are also necessary for mages. If their mana runs out or they want to save it for later, they'll have to switch to hand-to-hand combat. But with a sacred relic, Fiona didn't have to worry about that. Fiona realized she was tired of running and decided to fly on the wind. She used her magic. She had never trained before and relied entirely on her magic. The girl wasn't sure she'd be able to keep up with her new mage friends, but she was ready to do everything she could. And yet, the girl fell 2 laps behind the others. But at the end of the race, Layla praised her anyway and said it was excellent work. Fiona sat down on the ground, completely out of breath. She had run all 30 laps. Layla asked Graham to conjure some water for the girl. But Graham was indignant at this and didn't want to do anything for Fiona. He asked, "Why me of all people? After all, others here can conjure water too." And Layla replied sternly that he was the closest and that it was the commander's order. Graham obeyed after all, walked over to Fiona and held out his hand and asked her to open her mouth. He gave her a drink, and Fiona politely thanked the guy. Graham replied sullenly that he was just following orders. Fiona got up from the ground. Layla approached her. The woman was surprised by Graham's behavior. She had thought the guy would fawn over Fiona from head to toe, but he behaved surprisingly simply. Then the long-range spell training began. Fiona's magical power was still sealed, so during the lesson, she could only watch the other mages. All the students lined up and practiced wielding their magic. Fiona began to reminisce about her childhood. By creating a magical formula in her mind and channeling her mana into it, Fiona could activate a spell. Her teachers had explained to her in class as a child that this was exactly how magic worked, and little Fiona had diligently written it all down. However, each attribute requires its own formula, and sometimes it's quite difficult to keep it all in your head. The more complex and powerful the spell, the more formulas it requires. A person can activate only 2 attributes at a time, and what matters most is how quickly and accurately a person activates the spell. Layla's words interrupted Fiona's train of thought. The woman asked her if she'd like to share her thoughts with the others. Fiona was slightly surprised. Nearby, a blue-haired girl was practicing and had created her own magic circle. Fiona pointed out that the girl's magic circle could be improved. Layla was surprised by this insight. Fiona walked over to the girl. She tweaked something in her magic circle and improved it. The girl looked at Fiona with a mix of skepticism and indignation. But the circle really did become better and the magic more effective. The blue-haired girl reported that its power had doubled, while the amount of mana required remained the same. Layla praised Fiona for her help, and the mage girl thanked Fiona and said she was amazing. Everyone was very happy. Layla said she was going to check on the others and asked Fiona to let her know if she needed anything. The girl replied that everything would be fine. After the morning training session ended, Fiona and the group of mages went to the royal dining hall for a snack. Everyone sat at long tables with high chairs. Each person took an individual tray of food and enjoyed their meal. Suddenly, the same blue-haired girl from training approached Fiona. She asked if the seat next to her was free. Fiona replied that it was, and invited her to sit next to her. The girl introduced herself and said with a smile that her name was Nina. Fiona smiled back and said she was glad to meet her. Nina mentioned that Fiona had always eaten alone in her room until now and expressed her surprise. Fiona replied that from now on, she would always eat here with everyone. Layla watched the whole situation from a distance and kept an eye on things. She noticed that the girls had become friends and were sitting next to each other, and she realized that it seemed everything was fine with Fiona. After a while, Matthias decided to go see Fiona. He knocked on the girl's door, but no one answered. The guy got worried and didn't know what to do. Layla came up to him and noticed his anxiety. She asked him what was wrong. Matthias remembered that Layla also lived on this floor and felt a little tense. He explained to her that he wanted to invite Fiona to dinner, but she wasn't answering. But for some reason, Layla wasn't surprised by this. She walked over to the door and opened it without warning. And the door wasn't locked at all. Layla smiled and laughed at what she saw. Fiona was lying on the bed, fast asleep, curled up in a ball and hugging her pillow. Matthias was a little surprised by this and was still concerned about the girl's condition. He quickly found a blanket, and he carefully covered Fiona with it so she wouldn't get cold or wake up. Layla stood nearby and laughed at his behavior. She called him possessive and smirked. Matthias angrily told her to be quiet and continued to look after the girl. Layla remarked that it was no wonder she was tired after such a run. Matthias asked sternly if Fiona was all right. She replied that everything was fine, that Graham had grumbled, of course, but had helped her. And Fiona had become friends with Nina. But Layla warned that the only potential problem might come from Muriel. Matthias was surprised. He said that Muriel might be vindictive, but it wasn't her style to take it out on a newcomer. Layla replied that she hoped that was the case. And the guy said he wanted to know what Graham had been up to with Fiona, and he clenched his fists angrily across his chest. Layla sternly asked Matthias to stop being so overprotective of Fiona, or else everyone would end up hating him. It turned out Layla was referring to Graham's behavior. The guy was afraid to splash water on Fiona again and hurt her, because last time he'd already gotten a beating from Matthias for it. Graham told Layla this himself during class. The woman warned Matthias not to even think about pulling any stunts, or else Fiona would have to be embarrassed for him. Matthias's face turned sour and indignant. He couldn't think of what to say to Layla, so he remained silent and scowled. Meanwhile, Fiona woke up and let out a sound. She got up wearily and sat down on the bed, not expecting to see Matthias and Layla standing there. Matthias turned to Fiona and told her it was time for dinner. The girl was even more surprised by this, since she hadn't expected to fall asleep for so long. She quickly got out of bed and went to have dinner, but Matthias hurriedly stopped her. He said she couldn't go like that. Indeed, her dress was all wrinkled, and her ponytail was very messy after sleeping. Matthias carefully combed Fiona's hair and tied it into a neater ponytail so she would look her best for dinner. The girl thanked him. In response, the guy asked her to put something on. Layla watched them, and she noticed that Matthias really was acting like a mother. In response, the boy grunted in displeasure, and Fiona thought that she had been right after all. They found themselves back in the royal dining hall and began to eat dinner. The kids' trays held delicious, juicy meat, roasted vegetables, tea, and cutlery. The three of them sat down at the table. Fiona noticed that Matthias was eating a lot, as usual, and mentioned it to him. The guy confirmed it. He explained that using the sacred relic required a lot of energy, which was why he had to eat so much. But he was surprised and asked if it wasn't the same for Fiona. The girl replied that it was the same for her, but she didn't like to eat a lot of heavy food, so she mostly ate sweets. But she explained that when they decided to cut back on her diet, all the sweets disappeared. It got even worse because she had to replace the sweets with pills. Matthias replied that that sounded awful, and he added that here, Fiona could eat as much as she wanted. She thanked him. The guy mentioned that he'd heard Fiona had been running today and asked her how her legs were. Were they okay? Fiona was surprised by such an unexpected question and asked why he was so interested in her legs. Matthias replied that he remembered once cutting off the girl's right leg, just below the knee. Layla was listening to all this the whole time and silently eating pork ribs. Fiona replied that yes, that had indeed happened, and began to reminisce. She recalled that, it seemed, she hadn't been able to create a strong enough barrier back then, and Matthias's blade had been able to pass right through it. Fiona immediately froze the cut to stop the bleeding. She cast a couple of area of effect spells and vanished. Back then, Fiona was very worried that she might have overpowered the spell in her haste. The girl recalled all of this, told the guy about it, and sipped her tea leisurely. Then a couple of days later, Fiona told him she'd found out that no one had died. It was such a relief to her. The Empire's healers had patched her up so well that her legs were completely fine. Matthias apologized to her for the situation, but Fiona asked him not to apologize. After all, she had once torn his arms off herself. So, they were even. Matthias admitted that he had deliberately put himself in the way of the attack back then. Fiona was surprised by this and asked why he had done that. The guy replied that he just wanted to see the girl's reaction. Fiona asked again, why would he do that? Then she added, asking how his arms were now. Matthias said they were fine. He even felt that after they'd been sewn back on, he could control them better. Fiona replied that she felt the same way. Meanwhile, Layla continued to sit silently, staring at them intently, almost with malice. The two continued talking. Maybe, instead of treating severe injuries, it's easier to cut off the damaged part and then sew it back on. And suddenly Layla turned to Fiona and Matthias. With a tense, forced smile, she asked them to talk about something else for now. Her eyes were empty and unfriendly, and Matthias and Fiona listened to her. The next day, Fiona was sitting on a bench in the garden after class, all dirty and sad. She was wearing a pretty summer dress and a white shirt, but her clothes were covered in dirty stains. Her hair was too, as were her face and hands. The bright sun was shining outside, illuminating the girl's dirty hair, but it looked terrible. Suddenly, Graham walked up to Fiona and, with a sullen look on his face, asked what had happened to her. Fiona replied sarcastically that she had just been sitting there wondering what to do. They clearly didn't want to see each other, but the girl decided to take advantage of the situation. She asked Graham to pour water on her head. Graham responded to her request by saying that she was always a total pain in the neck and scowled. But the guy decided not to leave Fiona in trouble anyway. He created a magic circle, and using magic, he doused the girl from head to toe with water so she would be clean. It worked. Her hair shone again, and the stains on her dress disappeared. She politely thanked Graham for his help, and she mentioned that she'd already thought she'd have to sit there until she dried off so as not to dirty the hallway. Although, in that case, Fiona figured the dirt would already be falling off her. Graham stood in front of her. He guessed that Muriel had done it. The guy mentioned that Muriel had chestnut-colored hair and 2 pigtails. Fiona recognized the girl and said it was her. She didn't want to tell Graham about it, but she was glad that he understood and figured it out on his own. Graham sat down next to her on the bench and realized it was Muriel after all. He said she should have told the girl right away that such actions could have consequences. Fiona was scared. She asked, "What consequences are you talking about?" And Graham replied seriously that Matthias might beat her half to death. But Fiona honestly didn't understand him. She asked why Matthias would do that, and Graham smiled at her. He asked if it was true that Fiona still hadn't figured it out, and she got even more confused. It hadn't clicked yet, but she was thinking it over. She remembered that Graham had splashed water on her in the hallway and given her water to drink during practice. Fiona looked very puzzled and pensive, and then it dawned on her. She guessed that Matthias had done it because Graham had once splashed water on her, and Graham confirmed it, saying that she had guessed right and hit the nail on the head. She was horrified. She thought this was going too far. Her eyes widened in outrage and surprise. Graham explained that Matthias had even brought a healer with him that day to make sure he didn't lose his mind. Fiona was in shock. Suddenly, Luke appeared on the horizon and saw Graham and Fiona. He walked over to them. He explained that he'd noticed Fiona sitting there covered in mud and had rushed over right away. Luke asked Graham skeptically if he'd help the girl. Luke stood before them, exhausted, still catching his breath after the run. Graham answered in the affirmative. He added that, of course, he'd been too lazy, but he'd washed her off. Luke looked at Fiona and, with a sad look in his eyes, realized that Muriel had done this to her. But Fiona couldn't figure out how, and Luke realized that it was Muriel. She was certainly curious, but first she wanted to prevent a disaster. Frightened, she begged Graham and Luke not to tell Matthias about it, or else they'd be in big trouble. Fiona turned to Luke and asked if he had told Matthias what Graham had done. She asked him not to do that again. After all, this girl, Muriel, might hate him after something like that. Luke replied and explained that if he hadn't told Matthias everything, he would have gotten into trouble himself. And the guy added that in that case, Fiona herself should tell Matthias everything. After all, he'd definitely be happy to hear it. Graham confirmed his words and asked her not to refer to Muriel as a girl, but as a friend in their conversation. Fiona smiled and understood everything. That same day, during dinner with Matthias in her room, she told him everything in full detail. Matthias wasn't in the best of moods. Exactly 2 weeks had passed since Fiona joined the first Magic Division. Layla praised Fiona in class, saying she was doing a great job, and invited her to have lunch together. The girl quickly became friends with the other mages after they got to know each other better. But Muriel, they had often crossed paths with Fiona during her entire stay in the kingdom. Muriel always gave Fiona a wide berth, looked at her askance, remained silent, and didn't say hello. At times like these, Fiona thought Muriel hated her because of her past, and she was very worried about it. Fiona asked Luke and Graham why Muriel was so angry with her, but they didn't give her a clear answer. Luke just asked why Fiona was asking about it, and Graham replied indifferently that he had no idea. And the girl realized that her only option was that Muriel hated her. It was sad to realize this, but Fiona understood that it seemed she wouldn't be able to become friends with Muriel. And then, one fine day, she was urgently summoned to her room. Layla, Matthias, and Luke were there. They wanted to tell her something important. She was curious about what the conversation would be about. Then Luke smiled and suggested they get straight to the point. He cheerfully announced that they had been allowed to partially restore Fiona's magical powers. The boy asked the girl to hold out her right hand. Fiona was surprised and timidly held out her hand. Luke performed all the necessary steps to restore her powers and rubbed her wrist. Fiona looked at her hand with surprised eyes. Luke said that now she could use about 1/20th of her original power and asked her to try it out right away. Fiona held her hands out in front of her and decided to give it a try. She easily created 2 magic circles in her hands. Her face was still surprised, but calm nonetheless. Layla and Luke looked at the magic circles and gasped in surprise. Fiona replied calmly that she didn't feel any problems with her magic. Layla asked what that was and how the girl had managed to do it. Luke remarked that the speed at which she had constructed the magical formula was simply astonishing. The young man realized that, naturally, his casting speed was increasing with practice, but this was still something beyond belief. His face lit up with joy. He asked Fiona if this might be an effect of the sacred relic. The girl replied that the golden bracelet could only increase the user's mana pool. Layla said with a surprised look that it was amazing. She asked the girl how she had managed to reach such a level. Fiona explained that she had trained for 13 hours a day, and it had taken her several years. Layla was still amazed by Fiona's words. The woman said she doubted there was even one other person who had enough mana for such prolonged training. Fiona sat there as calm as ever, without a smile. She realized that she really did have the opportunity for such training. But without the golden bracelet, it's impossible. The girl replied to Layla that she was right about that. That was all the bracelet's power. Fiona slumped and lowered her head. Matthias, who was sitting in a chair next to the girl, joined the conversation. With a kind expression, he wanted to support her. He placed his hand on her knee and politely said that it wasn't the bracelet's power, but the result of the girl's perseverance. His eyes were very kind, and there was a sincere smile on his face. Fiona felt a little uneasy. Matthias understood and said that it must have been hard for her to achieve this. And he told her she had done an incredible job. Fiona was still surprised, but her face showed no emotion, and there was no smile on her face. She looked at the guy with disbelief. She replied indifferently that she had tried very hard, and memories from her childhood flooded her mind. When Fiona hadn't yet fully mastered magic, her teachers constantly scolded her. Even when it was unbearable, the girl couldn't complain to anyone. All she could do was cry, quietly alone in her room. Little Fiona smiled at her parents, so they wouldn't worry about her. But Matthias's words. Through her tears, the girl replied that all her efforts had paid off, and she thanked Matthias. The boy smiled. The next day, during class, Layla told all the students that today they would be having one-on-one battles. The woman turned to Fiona and said that today she could only use a portion of her power. So, she asked her to surrender before her mana ran out, just in case. Fiona obeyed the woman, and Layla gave the order to get started right away. The students lined up on the field and watched the others fight. A guy in glasses and a girl stepped onto the field, created their large magic circles, and fought. Their magic was very powerful. Fiona was even surprised. She stood next to Layla and realized that this was serious. The woman reassured Fiona and replied that large-scale spells were also allowed here. Layla said that even if someone got injured, they already had a healer on standby here. Indeed, a man in a robe, who was a healer, was standing nearby. In that case, Layla added, no one was afraid to strike with all their might. Fiona understood her. Meanwhile, the boy and girl on the field had finished their fight, and Layla announced the next participants, Muriel and Fiona. Muriel gasped in surprise and was horrified. She started getting angry, ran up to Fiona, pointed an accusing finger at her, and turned to Layla. The girl screamed and asked why she had to fight Fiona, and what good would such training do if Fiona couldn't even use all her mana. Layla told Muriel to be quiet and said that all complaints would be addressed after class. The woman turned to Fiona and asked her not to hold back, because it was the commander's order. Fiona stood there, tense and frightened, but she obeyed and took part in the battle. She was confident that the healers knew what they were doing, so she didn't need to worry. And so, Muriel and Fiona stepped onto the field and stood facing each other. Then they were given the command to begin. Muriel immediately realized she needed to cast a magical barrier and held her hands out in front of her. Fiona had already prepared her magic circle. Muriel realized that, given Fiona's mana, the barrier wasn't necessary. But the girl was confident she could take Fiona down with a single blow. Fiona didn't back down. She channeled all her magical power and was completely focused. The girl fired swift, icy arrows at Muriel. Muriel hadn't expected this and was surprised by her opponent's power. Next, Fiona unleashed water spheres and fire arrows. Muriel immediately realized that a tornado was coming. She fought with all her might, but she couldn't stand up to Fiona's magical power. A fierce battle raged. The girl fought through her tears. Fiona didn't let up. In the end, Fiona created many more magic circles, and she defeated Muriel completely. Layla was already screaming at Fiona to stop. The battle ended with the girl's victory. A healer immediately ran over to Muriel. He said the girl was lucky because she had gotten away with only minor scratches. Muriel looked at Fiona with all her hatred and malice and bared her teeth. She said she hated her. Suddenly, Muriel began to cry even harder and screamed that Fiona had taken her brother Matty away from her and that she couldn't stand her anymore. Fiona was surprised. Brother Matty? Fiona realized that Muriel was talking about Matthias. Ever since Fiona had settled in the kingdom, Matty had been ignoring Muriel. This made the girl very sad. She had to fight Fiona several times, though it wasn't a battle so much as an attempt to defend herself. Fiona is a user of a sacred relic, and her attack is impossible to withstand. Strong, beautiful, proud, a lone mage. That was exactly the impression Muriel had formed of Fiona. And then the girl fainted right in the middle of the fight. Luke and Matthias immediately rushed over to Fiona. Matthias picked her up, deeply worried for her. She lay unconscious, devoid of any emotion, as if lifeless. Matthias ordered everyone to deal with the remaining mages. The other students, including Muriel, watched the scene unfold in fear. Matthias was very concerned about Fiona. It was the first time Muriel had ever seen her brother Maddie like this. After returning to base, Commander Layla told all the apprentice mages what had happened to Fiona. For many years, she had been enslaved by a cursed seal, and whenever Fiona had to fight the mages, she would secretly come to their aid. Muriel was only now beginning to realize this. She realized that everything was finally coming together. Muriel began to feel sympathy for Fiona, now that she knew what she had been through. But with her arrival, Brother Maddie stopped caring about the girl. When Muriel and Matthias pass each other in the hallway, he just says hello and walks away. They no longer eat together. And when Matthias finally showed up in the dining hall, Muriel noticed that Fiona was by his side again. The girl admits that she was even more shocked by Fiona herself when she was introduced to the magicians. Muriel didn't understand why Fiona had even shown up at their place. She was furious. The girl thought of Fiona as a child with daisies in her head, and she couldn't believe that it was Fiona who had taken her brother Maddie away from her. All this time, Muriel had been watching Fiona, secretly hating her, and Fiona's magical power is completely sealed away. Muriel believes this makes Fiona nothing more than dead weight. But she helped Muriel. The girl admits to herself that Fiona does have a keen eye, and she knows a lot. But it infuriates her that with this girl's help, their squad could become many times stronger, and there's nothing she can do about it. In the past, Fiona was the Empire's most powerful mage, and Muriel remembers that one afternoon. She happened to peek into Fiona's room. The girl had let her long hair down and was admiring herself in the mirror. Muriel noticed that Fiona was beautiful, as if from a painting, but that only infuriated her even more. And so, that day, the girl poured a bucket of dirty water on Fiona. Fiona, despite everything, politely asked Muriel to pour the water on her head instead of her face, if possible. The girl simply ran away and didn't listen. That was when Graham appeared. Muriel ran away and burst into tears, stopping near the columns. From a distance, she watched as Fiona helped Graham and poured clean water over her. And now, Muriel realized she had lost. Because Fiona doesn't even have half her former strength now, and Muriel is still no match for her. That even without the sacred relic and large amounts of mana, Fiona was still strong. This made Muriel feel very resentful. And now, here they are, standing face to face. Muriel is crying and screaming that she hates Fiona, while the girl looks utterly bewildered and shocked. Muriel shouted at her that she had taken her brother Maddie away from her, and now she hates her. Fiona was very surprised and asked if she was talking about Matthias. And Muriel continued. She replied that she was. Matthias was like an older brother to Muriel, and she explained that ever since Fiona showed up, he hasn't paid any attention to her at all. He doesn't even eat dinner with her. Fiona was even more surprised. The girl lowered her head thoughtfully. She turned to Muriel and asked if the girl was angry with her for having fought against them. Was that why she was upset with her? Muriel replied that no, they weren't enemies anymore. And she cried out in a hurt voice that she sympathized with what had happened to Fiona, but that had nothing to do with her anger. And she angrily asked her not to take her brother Maddie away from her. Fiona calmly replied that she understood. Fiona smiled and decided to make sure by asking if it really had nothing to do with it. Muriel was surprised and asked angrily why the girl was smiling. Fiona explained that now she could breathe a sigh of relief. Muriel didn't understand why all of a sudden. She said that Fiona should be angry, not smiling. Fiona said she had no reason to be angry. Muriel shouted back in frustration and replied that Fiona had plenty of reasons to be angry. Layla overheard their loud conversation and asked them to sort things out later, since they weren't alone in class. Muriel ran off silently, in tears, while Fiona watched her go with sad eyes. Nina, standing nearby, exclaimed to Fiona that she was simply amazing. Even Graham agreed. He was there too and remarked that the speed at which Fiona had cast all those spells was simply mind-blowing. The girl heard this praise and began to smile sweetly again. After her morning training, Fiona decided to check on Muriel and went up to her room. She knocked politely on the door and asked if she could come in. A displeased Muriel opened the door and asked what she wanted. Fiona replied that she wanted to talk. Muriel flung the door open and grudgingly let her in. Fiona thanked her and stepped inside carefully. The girl slammed the door shut and stood in front of Fiona, looking hurt. She apologized for pouring dirty water on the girl. Muriel said she wouldn't bother her anymore because she didn't want to cause trouble for the squad. She just wanted them to work as a well-coordinated team. The girl crossed her arms over her chest. It was clear that it was unpleasant and uncomfortable for her to say such things. Fiona listened to her and thanked her sincerely once again. She replied that she, too, had to apologize for taking Matthias away. Muriel was surprised, but the girl continued. To Fiona, Matthias was the one who looked after her, and he was always taking care of her. She explained that she no longer needed to be looked after, but he still continued to watch over her. The girl promised to talk to him and tell him she didn't need that. But in truth, Fiona didn't really want to tell him that. He was Muriel's beloved older brother, and Fiona knew she had no right to monopolize his attention. Of course, she was sad that they wouldn't be able to see each other as often anymore. But Matthias had been Muriel's brother long before he met Fiona. The girl said she hoped that she and Muriel would get along in the future. The girl's face still looked surprised, and Fiona, so as not to embarrass her, decided to leave quickly. But Muriel knows that Fiona isn't a bad person, and the girl confessed this to her. She said she wasn't exactly against them hanging out with her brother Matty, and she asked, "Isn't he dear to her too?" And Fiona replied that yes, he was dear to her, just like Mom. And Muriel was horrified. "She thinks brother would be more appropriate," she exclaimed. And Fiona snapped that Matthias couldn't be anyone other than Mom. And she said it as if cutting her off. Muriel now felt sorry for her brother. She didn't understand why she had even bothered with Fiona back then, if that's how things turned out. The girl didn't argue any further and agreed with Fiona's opinion. And she added that in that case, they wouldn't get in each other's way at all. She explained that to her, Matthias was a brother, and to Fiona, he was a mom. Muriel relaxed and leaned against the door, looking at Fiona with a different gaze, a friendlier one. Fiona smiled and confirmed that Muriel was right and that they had completely different relationships with Matthias. But the girl quietly muttered to herself, sadly, that she felt like an idiot. There was sadness in her eyes, resentment toward herself for her behavior. Fiona heard this and asked her to repeat it, wanting to know what had happened. Muriel replied that she was just talking to herself, and she suggested they have lunch together in the cafeteria. They were both happy and went to eat. Fiona is now starting to worry whether the day will ever come when this dandelion, Muriel, will accept Matthias's feelings. They arrived at the cafeteria, which was packed with people. The girls went up to the counter, and Muriel asked Fiona what she wanted to eat. Fiona chose carefully and started looking through the shelves of food. Then, finally, she said she wanted something sweet. Muriel disagreed with her and replied sternly that sweets are for dessert, and you need to eat properly. Fiona laughed and said that, in her opinion, the girl was just like her mom. But Muriel jokingly asked her not to make her out to be a mom and not to call her that. They laughed together and sat down at the table, setting down their trays. Matthias saw them, and he joined them with a tray of food. Fiona welcomed him back, to which the guy smiled and sincerely thanked her. In a kind voice, he remarked and reported that he and Muriel had gotten along. Fiona replied with a smile that it had happened just recently. Matthias was even surprised. Meanwhile, Muriel ate in silence, watching them with a sulky look. She thought she understood that everything was obvious to them anyway. And she calls him Mom. Muriel couldn't believe it, and she started to think. To her, Matthias had always been an authority figure, but now the girl thought he was starting to look very pathetic. And suddenly Fiona spoke seriously to Matthias, because she remembered their recent conversation with Muriel in the room and the promise she'd made to the girl. She said she wanted him to spend more time with Muriel, just like he did before she arrived. Matthias was surprised and didn't understand the request at first. And Muriel was in shock and didn't know how to explain it, because she didn't want to admit that she had complained to Fiona. The girl wanted to say something, but nothing came to mind, and she felt embarrassed. After all, she had always wanted to tell Matthias that she wanted him to pay more attention to her. Fiona began to explain. She turned to the guy and said that the thing was Matthias had been spending all his time with her lately, and because of that, Muriel felt lonely. That's why she wants him to spend more time with her. Muriel felt even more embarrassed, and she felt awkward. But Matthias understood everything now. It was true. He admitted that he was spending more time with Fiona now. He had looked after Muriel when she was very young, and, to him, she was like a little sister. But Muriel is already 17. It seemed to Matthias that she no longer needed her older brother, so he decided to gradually start distancing himself. But he realized that, because of his decision, she only felt abandoned. Muriel shyly lowered her head, and Matthias gently stroked her head, and he politely apologized to her. The girl forgave him. Fiona smiled and was glad to see this. She was pleased to see the bond between Muriel and Matthias being restored. But still, Fiona caught herself thinking that she was jealous. She looked at Matthias's plate. He asked if she wanted some meat, but she replied that she didn't really want any, and she was still sad. Muriel looked at her and understood. The girl thought that Fiona also wanted Matthias to stroke her head, and she said so. Matthias asked if that was really true, and offered to stroke her head. Fiona was embarrassed and didn't know what to say. In her opinion, Muriel looked so happy at that moment, and the girl wanted to experience that too. Honestly, Fiona wanted to say yes. She tensed up. Muriel sat across from her, smiled, and gave her the go-ahead. Fiona turned shyly toward the guy and asked him to stroke her hair too. Matthias didn't refuse and gently stroked her head and hair, very gently and tenderly. A shy smile appeared on the girl's face, along with a slight blush of embarrassment. After that, she replied that she had enjoyed it and thanked the guy. Matthias smiled back in response. Fiona decided to go get dessert and ran off. Matthias and Muriel were left alone. The girl turned to her brother and noticed that he was having a hard time. Matthias realized that Muriel had figured everything out. She replied that Fiona was the only one who hadn't caught on yet, and the boy told her she was right. A little over a year ago, when the Empire had just begun stealing Elsaida's magic stones, there was a fight between Matthias and Fiona. Graham noticed that she didn't even bat an eyelid when she hurled that powerful spell at them. The boy was covered in blood, burns, and scratches. Standing before him was a distraught Muriel. Graham asked if she could do anything about Fiona. Muriel was beside herself with fear and screamed that it was impossible, that only her brother Maddie could handle her. Layla was nearby, also covered in bandages. She said seriously and warily that it felt as though Fiona had an endless supply of mana, and against that they were powerless. Detachments of mages and knights regularly patrolled the borders to scare off thieves, but in the end, they returned barely alive. And it was all because of one mage, Fiona. Matthias recalled the events from before he had even met Fiona. Even back then, he had noticed that the girl wore a gold bracelet, and that she was most likely the bearer of a sacred relic. He had realized then that his only option was to stand against her himself, and he was resolutely prepared to do so. In front of his fighters, the young man announced that he would be patrolling the northern territories, because that's where the largest reserves of magic stones were. You never know where enemies will appear, and they need to be careful. Layla and Muriel hoped for the best. 3 days later, there she was, Fiona, a mage in a robe, with the gaze of an eagle, a magic staff in hand, the strongest of them all. She was truly beautiful, and Matthias knew it. Everything was just as they had said, but at that moment, it didn't matter to him because they were about to fight. The Kingdom squad fought with all their might, casting every spell. But Fiona cast her gigantic magic circle into the sky, and very quickly. Matthias was stunned by this. He doubted that anyone in their ranks could withstand that spell. Then he decided to use his sacred relic, which was capable of cutting through anything. The battle continued. Weapons flew, swords were drawn. Fiona did not back down. She fought in the name of the Empire. And so, Fiona and Matthias, as enemies, glared at each other with malice and rivalry. Neither wanted to back down. But by the end of the battle, the Empire was forced to retreat. The Kingdom of Elsaida once again lodged a complaint with the Empire. The Empire's troops grew increasingly bold and increased the frequency of their raids. And every time, they fought them off. Fiona commanded her troops against the Empire, insisting they must not retreat. Suddenly, during one of the battles, she was wounded. Immediately, cries rang out that Lady Fiona was wounded and that the Empire must retreat. Matthias saw this. After the battle, the defeated Kingdom unit also retreated, victorious. Sometime later, Lord Matthias was in his office. It was his day off. Servants rushed to him, apologizing for interrupting his day off, and Matthias immediately guessed. The Empire had attacked again. He immediately gave the order to advance in a battle without delay, and they fought Fiona once more. The young man already knew that, as always, Fiona was no easy opponent. During the next battle, one of the kingdom's fighters, a young man, was wounded. But suddenly, he felt better right away. He lay on the ground, stunned, not knowing what to do. Matthias saw this and thought that one of their mages had helped the guy. Suddenly, in the middle of the fight, Fiona leaned forward heavily, dropped her head, and clutched her heart. Matthias didn't understand this. He thought he had imagined it. Fiona's face looked terribly pained at that moment, but she didn't give in, trying not to show it. And then Matthias noticed that she suddenly had a bout of pain. This seemed strange to him. The longer he watched, the more often he began to notice it. Whenever one of the kingdom's mages faced mortal danger, they miraculously survived, while Fiona's condition worsened. Matthias became curious. Was she deliberately using a white magic circle to avoid suspicion? Was that how she wanted to fight? The young man didn't understand, but he was determined and persistent in his quest to find out. Fiona created a magic circle and cast her spell. It hit Matthias in the shoulder. His left arm was completely severed, but it seemed he realized he had miscalculated the trajectory. But that wasn't so important to him. He decided to call it a day. The other mages came to his aid and ordered that Matthias be healed immediately, helping him stand up to Fiona and the entire empire. Someone gave the order to retreat, to defend the rear. All the knights and soldiers reported that their weapons were already in place. The empire was retreating, and the decision was made to pursue them. Fiona fought to the very end. Tears of pain welled up in her eyes. She wanted to help the kingdom's soldiers retreat. Matthias looked at her and realized she was too sweet. And it was at that very moment that Matthias fell in love with her. He wondered if they could become allies in the future. After the battle, Luke said that he thought there was a cursed mark on Fiona's body. He was even ready to bet on it. His conviction was unwavering, and Matthias understood. He replied that if the girl was truly fighting against her will, he would like to win her over to their side. An emergency meeting was convened in the royal hall. The king sat on the throne with a serious expression, listening to Matthias's orders. The young man was ready for anything, even if he had to use his influence. He told everyone that he planned to bring the girl here and make her their ally. The young man made it clear right away that no one would dare to object, and he warned that if anyone opposed him, he would deal with them personally. The king understood him too and agreed. He allowed the young man to do as he saw fit. Matthias made his decision. To start with, he gave the order to provide a room for the girl where she would live. Matthias was sure she would prefer a comfortable room. Layla helped him pick out clothes and set up such a comfortable room. After a while, all the preparations were complete. All that was left for Matthias was to convince her. Another battle began, and Matthias had a plan ready. He had to use force. Matthias made a decision. First, he needed to place Luke's cursed seal on her to weaken her. And he set to work. That was the plan, but the girl suddenly collapsed. Matthias ran to her, frightened, and ordered Luke to bring the shackles. Fiona wasn't moving. Her eyes were closed, and she was barely breathing. He put the shackles on her, and Luke ran over. The guy said they needed to remove that cursed seal from the girl immediately. Matthias agreed. The guy picked the girl up. She was unconscious, fast asleep. He gave the order that it was time to return to the capital. Luke was surprised. He asked, "Are we really not going to tell anyone?" Matthias replied that it was too much of a hassle and hurried Luke along. Matthias carried her to her new room in the kingdom and laid her on the bed. The young man waited patiently for her to wake up, and by noon the next day, she opened her eyes. The guy walked into the room without knocking because he thought Fiona was still asleep, and he apologized to her. He already liked her back then. Fiona sat on the bed, frightened, after waking up. And at that moment, Matthias began to think, and his head was filled with so many questions he wanted answers to. What would Fiona's first reaction be? Would she trust them, or refuse to cooperate with the enemies? He was very curious, and it didn't matter to him how the girl behaved. He was ready to try to get through to her until she trusted them. Fiona looked at him, a little embarrassed, and replied that he had nothing to apologize for, and that everything was fine. That there was no need to worry so much about the enemy's feelings. These words were very different from what Matthias had expected. But he could say one thing, that Fiona was a sweetheart. Then she told the guy about how unfairly she had been treated in the Empire. And Matthias made a decision. He wanted to spoil her. Unfortunately, he couldn't tell Fiona about his feelings just yet. He took care of her every day, wanting to repay her for helping the kingdom. Matthias believed it would be easier for her to accept those feelings. That it was still too soon. And just being close to the person you love is already a true miracle. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.